Modern.
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 We're prepping for a voyage.
Modern.
The force of an old-fashioned equals whiskey mass times bitters acceleration.
Why don't you make that a double?
Modern bar cart.
What's shaking, cocktail fans? Welcome to episode 153 of the Modern Bar Cart podcast. I'm your host, Modern Bar Cart CEO Eric Kozlik. Thanks for joining us for another interview episode where we track down the best and brightest minds in the spirits and cocktail world so that we can share their secrets with you. This time around, I catch up with Jake Parrott of Haus Alpenz, one of the premier spirits importers in the U.S., focusing on European spirits, liqueurs, and fortified wines. That last category is of particular interest because it ain't just vermouth and sherry we're talking here. More on that later. I've really been hoping to talk to somebody in the distribution and importation industry for a while now because I think it really is one of the missing links in most people's understanding of the spirits industry. Right? It's easy to think about a bottle being created at a distillery, but how it gets to be on the shelves at your liquor store or behind your favorite cocktail bar is a detail that sort of intentionally gets swept under the rug in many cases. In this interview, we talk about what makes Haus Alpenz special in the spirits importation and distribution world. But first, let's take a quick time out so that you can make yourself a drink. This episode's featured cocktail is the Rose Cocktail. To make it, you'll need 2 ounces of French vermouth, such as Dolin, which we cover in depth later in the episode, 1 ounce of Kirschwasser, which is a cherry eau de vie. So it's going to be made out of a cherry fruit base, and it's going to be completely clear and unaged. 1 teaspoon of raspberry syrup, most popular as the key ingredient in the Clover Club cocktail. And if you're a fan of our embitterment bitters, a dash or 2 of orange or lavender would be pretty nice in this drink, at least in my opinion. Combine all these ingredients in a mixing glass with ice, stir for about 20 seconds until everything is well chilled and diluted, then strain into a stemmed cocktail glass and enjoy. There's no traditional garnish stipulated here, so I'd recommend following the lead of whichever vermouth you've chosen to use and selecting a garnish accordingly. It's interesting that the only descriptor of the vermouth that I could find in this drink recipe is French. Now, that definitely does tell us something, namely that it's a bit less sweet and often more floral than Italian vermouths, but it doesn't tell us whether we should dope a sweet vermouth or a dry vermouth, or perhaps something like a white vermouth, into this recipe. When I come up against situations like this in the cocktail world, I usually advise you to follow your heart. Which bottle do you think would pair best with Kirschwasser and raspberry syrup? In most cases, I think this is going to be a dry or occasionally a white vermouth, so if you're on the fence, opt for one of those. The Rose Cocktail is one member of Jake's impregnable quadrilateral of low-alcohol stirred drinks, so if that doozy of a title intrigues you, be sure to join us for the lightning round to find out what the other 3 members might be. So, now that you're well equipped with a sessionable yet sophisticated cocktail to speed you on your way, let's turn our attention back to the interview. In this really informative chat with Jake Parrott, National Sales Representative for spirits importer Haus Alpenz, some of the topics we cover include how Jake took a hobbyist interest in spirits and turned it into a profession, in essence, the sort of story that a lot of our listeners might find inspiring. How Haus Alpenz grew to become one of the foremost champions of spirits and fortified wines that don't often make it to the U.S. The story of Dolin Vermouth and how it changed the face of the mixed drink scene at a key moment in the cocktail renaissance. Then we conduct a 2-bottle tasting of Haus Alpenz spirits, including Pasubio Vino Amaro and Dolin Genepy. We also cover a lot of the ins and outs of the spirits importation and distribution game, including how bottles make their way to the U.S. from abroad and how various regulatory and logistical hurdles are cleared. We also talk about the fascinating oxidized and rancio wines from Spain and the south of France, what indispensable tool Jake carries on him at all times when doing demos, and much, much more. This conversation has it all: tasting notes, history, geography, culture, and some fun inside baseball that sheds light on often overlooked aspects of the spirits distribution game. Jake is a wealth of knowledge, and his palate is second to none. So I do recommend following him and Haus Alpenz on social media and calling your local liquor store to learn which of their labels are available in your neck of the woods. With that, please enjoy this excellent interview with Jake Parrott of Haus Alpenz. Jake, thanks for being on the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So, as we like to do here, can you just start us off by talking a little bit about who you are and what you do?
So my name is Jake Parrott. I'm a national sales rep for a company called Haus Alpenz. We're importers of products and represent a wide range of stuff, both in the classic cocktail and spirits world, but also a little bit of traditional aged oxidative wines. And so before COVID time, my job was to travel and teach and help our distributors sell the breadth of our portfolio to retailers, to bars, to restaurants, and then educate every one of those types of customers on the best way to use best ways to use each product to get value out of their own world.
Yeah. So I imagine that your job looks very different now. Can you talk about the road that you took to find your way to Haus Alpenz?
Yeah, we'll start by saying that the drinks enthusiast community in 2005 was a very different world. It was a small community, and I started as a whiskey enthusiast, as so many people are now, and met a fellow named Bill Thomas, who, if he hasn't been on the show already, probably should be. He's the owner now of Jack Rose Dining Saloon in Washington, D.C. Back then, he owned two bourbon-themed bars, both called Bourbon, in Washington, D.C. And through him and through some contacts on the West Coast, I met Drew Colesveen at Kentucky Bourbon Distillers, or what we now call the Willett Distillery in Bardstown, and was able to, with Bill, pick a few barrels of Willett Family Estate, a couple of very famous rye barrels and some bourbon barrels. And we kept picking barrels, and we couldn't find a distributor to clear them in to DC so that mostly they could be sold at Bourbon, and a little bit sold to some retailers and some other bars. And so some of Bill's friends got together and sort of set up a small distributor to clear the product. And over time, because of Bill and my connections and some other folks' connections in the nascent cocktail scene, some other opportunities became available to represent some other product lines. We brought Aviation Gin to Washington, D.C. We brought Nissan and Le Favorite rums to Washington, D.C. And a few folks introduced us to Eric Seed of Haus Alpenz, who was at that point already getting a reputation of bringing in those lost and forgotten cocktail ingredients that we all wanted after reading books like Ted Hayes' book, Vintage Spirits and Forgotten Cocktails. And so we took him on, and that was about a year before Eric started working with Vermouth Dolin, which is sort of what turned Haus Alpenz into a bigger company, or at least a company with more turnover and sales. By 2012, my wife and I were able to make it so I could make a career change, and I went to start work for Eric.
That's awesome. That's a really cool story, and there's obviously some interesting players in there. Bill from Jack Rose, obviously it's an institution here in DC. It was kind of tough to see them have to put all of their rare and expensive bottles on a fire sale to help fund their way through this situation here. But I have a feeling that they'll probably come out all right in the end.
Yeah, it's not a fire sale. It's they've been getting good money and keeping their team together for it. They've started to slowly reopen the roof deck at Jack Rose. We'll see what's going on in the future. But Bill had already been working on allowing bars to sell package at retail anyway, at least in a few specific contexts. And so he was ready when this became available.
Right. Well, I think maybe an interesting place to kind of dig into now would be with the product, as you mentioned, that kind of made Haus Alpenz, as you mentioned, Dolin, which most Americans would pronounce Dolin. We see these bottles kind of ubiquitously on the shelves now, which is great because that wasn't the case maybe 5 to 7 years ago. But the Rouge, the Blanc, and the Dry are pretty much a staple in any good liquor store that has any sort of cocktail following. So can you talk a little bit about that brand and maybe tell the story of Dolin and how they transformed not only Haus Alpenz but also kind of the cocktail industry?
I think I think it's easy to look back and see that impact as being very large. I think at the time it was simply a product at a nice price that could keep retailers interested in what we were doing, and the Dry providing a very different style of dry vermouth than what you saw out there. You either had Italian products that were on the sweet end of things, or a product like Noailles Prat, which is kind of different in America than it is elsewhere. And Dolin had a freshness to it that kind of pricked people's ears up. People got excited to taste vermouth. Still today, every so often I'll pour someone Dolin Dry for the first time. But I think a lot of what it was simply having a product at a very good price that we could sustain and grow with us as a company and with our distributors as a company. It's certainly nice to be known as being associated with Dolin when I talk to bar folks, but it's the ability to get retailers all the way through the spectrum, from enthusiast retailers to grocery, to get on board was a real key point for us as a company.
Well, and it's interesting too. Like think about a bar and think about a liquor store situation, and you admittedly find yourself in both roles, right? Speaking to bartenders and bar teams, and then speaking to the off-premise sales teams. When I look at a product like Dolin, what makes it so special to me is the fact that okay, we know that as of at least going back a couple years, about half a decade, bar teams have access to these cool bottles through reps like you that they can, kind of build a program around. But unfortunately, a lot of those bottles come at a price point where it's not going to be accessible for a home bartender to just go ahead and make an impulse buy or pull the trigger on it unless they're super well off. And I think the difference with Dolin is that all of a sudden we've got this product line that is making huge impact in the quality of cocktails, but it is at that impulse buy price point, and they have the variety of bottle sizes, which makes that even easier. With bitters that we create and sell, we even see a lot of tentativity when it comes to how often am I going to use this? If that's a question that you have when you look at a bottle, a small bottle of Dolin Rouge or Dry Vermouth, the answer is, you're spending $10, $12, and you'll, at worst, that's a pretty easy sunk cost to swallow if you don't end up liking it. So that's, to me, is the difference between something like a Dolin and maybe some of the other bottles that you may carry in your portfolio, like some of the more expensive rums or some of the more esoteric rancio wines, for example.
Well, and I think part of that, though, was also we were the first people in a long time to very broadly go out and sell and educate about vermouth and other aromatized wines, in particular about putting aromatized wines in the fridge. And maybe it's too presumptuous to say teaching people how to taste aromatized wines, but at least helping giving them the tools to succeed and be better tasters of aromatized wines. And that's been a huge thing, and it helps sustain conversations when conversations need to be sustained. And so
Yeah, I think we'll come back to education certainly later in the interview because you're pretty legendary for some of the ways that you choose to go about educating palates. So I'm excited to talk about that. But could you give us a kind of a summary of Haus Alpenz's portfolio in a bit more detail? Because obviously the name of the company itself sort of indicates that there might be an Italy, France, kind of Germany, Switzerland focus in the Alps. And obviously there's certain categories of products that happen to arise there, many of which really don't make it to our shores very often unless they are, from a company that's like a Campari, for example. So I was hoping that you could just take us through some of your, just a little bit more detail so that people can understand what your portfolio is and kind of how it moves.
Sure. So we started with Austrian products, which is where the name comes from. Eric had studied in Austria and worked in Austria and is a skier. So our very first product was actually Zerbenz, which is a liqueur made from the fruit of a very particular alpine conifer that's sort of the classic après ski in Austria. The part of the fun of that time in the drinks enthusiast world was that you could start by cultivating a small community. And that small community was just happy to meet other curious people. They weren't overloaded with marketing. They weren't overloaded with events or anything like that. And through Eric's work in Austria, he met other spirits producers in Austria and in other places. And through his work in the field, especially in Colorado and California and New York, he met people who, like Ted Hay, Daryl Cordy, when you're talking about Koki, who had interests in other products, and he had the time and inclination to go and pursue them. And so, to say Haus Alpenz is the evolution of one man's vision is pretty close to accurate. We could grow with our community or with the community, both in terms of our staff, but also in terms of how much stock we would take on of a product.
Right. So luckily we were able to kind of chat before this interview, and I already had a bottle of the Dolin Genepy, which is a very near and dear product to my heart. And then you hooked me up with a tip about this Pasubio Amaro. So, I like to taste on air because I think it gives people a sense of place and a sense of, just kind of like being there and imagining being able to use these products. So do you want to just do a quick little 2-bottle tasting so we can get a sense?
Sure. And I'll try to do as much of the talking as possible so that there won't be too much slurp sounds. So Pasubio Vino Amaro comes from our friends at Erboristeria Cappelletti. Cappelletti is a wonderful family liqueur producer and Amaro maker. They have they don't have a still on site, but they do sell some distilled products that they make on a friend's still. And their history goes back to 1906 as sort of the local herbalist for the city of Trento. Trento is north of Verona. It's kind of the last city in Italy up the Adige until you get up to Innsbruck through the Brenner Pass and up to Innsbruck in Austria. And so matter of fact, they had a store in Trento that if you go to it today, they don't own it anymore, though a lot of their products are there. It looks like a natural pharmacist. So the Erboristeria essentially means natural pharmacist. And what Pasubio is a recipe, kind of a local expression recipe from their archives. A very typical combination in their region of wild blueberry, mugo, which is a scrub pine, kind of comes up to your hip, and you use the springtime tips, and a little bit of rhubarb root. Rhubarb root, something you see in all kinds of mountain Amari. It's smoky. If you've ever had Cappelletti's Amaro Sfumato, that's almost entirely rhubarb root. So that's quite a bit smokier. Here it's just an accent. Now this this recipe, they had made many different versions of this recipe over their history. Some spirit-based, some wine-based, some sweeter, some drier. And so we worked with them to resurrect the recipe. We got to discuss with them the choices that could be made. And so we always like to do wine-based things, partially because it's easier to sell them in some states, but also because if you're a 1906 producer in a rural area, virtually everything you made at the beginning was wine-based because spirits were tough to acquire in large quantities or expensive before 1919. So this is wine-based. The base is Marsala. Marsala wine is not from the Alto Adige, but it is something that Cappelletti had always traded in. Been kind of the local supplier of Marsala for cooks mainly in that part of Italy. And the sugar level is relatively low compared to a lot of Italian Amari. And that's a manifestation of their palates. We're very fortunate. Maddalena Cappelletti, who looks after the business and is also kind of the nose of the establishment, she genuinely loves bitter in a way that is really helpful when you're trying to provide a bitter backbone to a cocktail here in America. So you got the great acidity from the Marsala and the blueberries, not super sweet, super low caramel, because caramel when it gets cold can get a bit thick. So something that's a lot of fun, and then a great old imagery and an old name from their archives.
It's a beautiful flavor. It's funny. I did like a little preemptive tasting, and when I was doing that tasting, I got like a lot of, sort of oxidative, like Madeira-like notes, and so it kind of maps on with like I was completely unaware of the Marsala connection, but it makes complete sense relative to where it comes from, and I think if anybody listening has experienced Marsala in a non-cooking format, maybe that was a mistake. Right? Like you opened that bottle of Marsala that was not refrigerated on accident and decided that you were going to, take a sip and go for it. And that was probably a mistake. Or you just end up, with just a mouthful of, like, as you mentioned, the caramel, the sugar. Marsala, at least in my experience, tends to be a very sweet category and would not necessarily be my first go-to if I were to, if someone were to put a gun to my head and say, all right, design me an Amaro, I wouldn't be like, all right, bust out the Marsala. But I think it plays really well, as you mentioned, with the acidity in those blueberries, which is like a very sort of like a wildernessy alpine associative flavor. So I think it's really nice there. And I was kind of struggling to identify the exact strain of bitterness in this. I was trying to figure out what the bittering agent could be, and that rhubarb root, like, it's so obvious. Like, as soon as it came out of your mouth, I was like, of course. But I don't think I would have been able to pull that out unless I really sat there and started comparing it to other things in my liquor cabinet. But it's beautiful, and it's only 17% ABV. Can you talk about that low ABV and maybe if there was any controversy or struggle of having that recognized as an Amaro as opposed to like a very bitter vermouth?
I mean, it's not. Well, first of all, it's not a vermouth because it does have wormwood in it. So that's a very important thing that we spend a lot of time educating folks on categories of aromatized wine. In fact, I helped the folks at the Wine and Spirit Education Trust with the content for the level 3 spirits portfolio on aromatized wine. I think it helps for us in that it's not the first Vino Amaro in our portfolio. We've worked for many years with Cardamaro, which is made in Nizza Monferrato in Italy, which is bittered with Cardoon. And so I think we'd already kind of gone down the road of, hey, Amaro just means bitter. It can be wine, it can be spirit. In fact, if you go back far enough and you get rural enough, it was almost certainly wine.
Yeah, well, and it goes all the way back to the Romans, in order to
and farther.
Yeah, to preserve anything for transport, you had to do something to it, and herbs and spices very often just ended up being the best way to do that. So, what sort of applications do you usually recommend for Pasubio, or perhaps getting into some pairings and things of that nature?
We'll start with drink stuff. I think one of my team, Lee Edwards, came upon the idea of Pasubio and lemonade, which I think is pretty much perfect. What a shock! Blueberries and lemon go together. So that's definitely one that I really love. We don't have a huge tradition of fizzy lemonade or bottled fizzy lemonade here in America, which is unfortunate. But you can make it yourself. It's pretty easy. I think we've all learned in COVID time that a can of club soda costs about 25 cents. So in terms of spirits, there's a variety of ways you can go. I've used this as the bitter element in a pretty soft Negroni or Boulevardier. But I would say probably my favorite easy thing to do with it is to just mix it with wheated bourbon.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, something on the soft side. You don't want to. A really intense bourbon might combine a bit harshly with the tannins of the blueberries. You know, these are those little itty bitty wild blueberries, not the big fat ones we get from New Jersey in the supermarket. So they've got a fair amount of structure to them in addition to sweetness and acidity. So a softer, creamier whiskey works really, really well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I was looking. I don't know if it was on your site or on Capoletti's site. I think it was on Haus Alpenz. You've got a couple of recommendations for it. You've got almost like a 50-50 martini, but instead of gin, you've got the Pasubio Amaro combined in equal parts with the Dolin Dry. And that's called the Little Dolomite.
That's a gorgeous drink.
You're kind of referencing the mountain range that separates these two regions, right?
Yeah, that's from Christina Helmer up in New York. And just a really, really good example of how alcohol is not necessarily the carrier of flavor in a stirred cocktail or a built cocktail.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just taking this cocktail that as an example here, it's 1.5 ounces of the Pasubio with 1.5 ounces of the Dolin Dry, and I love that because it is. It is both sessionable and unexpectedly complex, I think. If you were to tell me, listen, you're going to take a dry vermouth and then you're going to combine it with this Amaro that's, very low alcohol relative to what immediately jumps to your head with the word Amaro, and you're going to stir these together and you're going to, serve them up with, it says the garnish would be like maybe a thyme sprig or something like a bitter cucumber slice with the peel still left on it. I'd be like, I don't know, what else you got? But having tasted the Pasubio and being familiar with the Dolin Dry, I mean, it's just, it's got to be like a symphony in your mouth.
Yeah, the Dolin Dry. We have to talk about Dolin Dry in the context of martinis usually, and one of my favorite things to say about it is add structure where structure is needed and texture where texture is needed. And in this case, Pasubio is bringing the texture, and so Dolin provides kind of the scaffold, in a sense, its own kind of dilution as well as some supplemental botanicals.
Yeah, incredible. So what about food? What would you, it's strange in that it has a lightness of an aperitivo, but it, like you literally look at it, it's dark and it's got the smoky rhubarb in it. So it's kind of leaning in maybe slightly separate directions here. What would you pair with this?
So I haven't done a ton of pairing events with Pasubio, but I did one that was really kind of perfect. Pasubio is a high acid Amaro with a hint of smoke. There's a Basque cheese that's reasonably well available called Idiazabal, Idiazabal. And it is a high acid cheese, being a sheep smoked cheese, that is lightly smoked. And so they work really well together. And I would say in general, sheep's milk cheeses, especially harder sheep's milk cheeses, work really, really well with Pasubio. If you lengthen it with soda or tonic or the aforementioned fizzy lemonade, then a gentler cheese would work very well as well.
Yeah, I could see Pasubio working really well in a high quality tonic because I think the quinine and the smoked rhubarb wouldn't really clash. I think they'd complement each other more than they'd clash for sure. Which is not always the case with the rhubarb. You got to be very careful with that sfumato. Otherwise, you can end up with a drink that is all lopsided.
Yeah, people love barbecue, though.
That's true. So, do you want to speak a little bit about the Dolin Genepy, since I've got the bottle here?
Sure. So Genepy is a category. It is the sort of traditional après-ski in the Savoyard, the French Alps. It is the name Genepy is also the name of the most prominent herb that's used in traditional Genepy. It's one of the petite wormwoods. I've heard it described in English as mountain sage before, which seems maybe too cute by half. Now, this is a product. When we talk about spirit-based botanical things, it's very important to recognize there's two ways you can extract flavor into spirit. One is to macerate, and one is to macerate and redistill, or distill through a gin basket or something like that. And you get two very different profiles when you do that. When you distill a macerate of bitter stuff, you don't get the bitterness. Most of the bitter molecules are too heavy to come over. You get the nose, you get the lift, you get the brightness, and nose is such an important way to want to get back into a drink, to take a second sip. So with the Dolin Genepy, there's a mix of herbs in which the herb Genepy is prominent, that is macerated, redistilled, and then reinfused before being sweetened and proofed to 45% ABV in our case. And so you get both the high and the low. And that's a big part of the fun, is that if you dilute this in a cocktail, you're still going to smell those great high notes, but you're also going to get the bitter structure and the herbal structure in the drink. So it works very well even in very long drinks, but it also lets other things speak.
Yeah, I could see this obviously working as a substitute for chartreuse, like in a chartreuse swizzle, for example. That's like a nice long, slightly bright and refreshing drink where you could, see this working. Obviously, you've got a little bit of green, kind of green yellow or yellow greenness that kind of indicates that post-distillation maceration with the obviously something chlorophyllic, probably Genepy on both ends.
Yep.
And yeah, it's an herb that really doesn't make its way to the United States. I was working with a distiller friend of mine to just try and build a flavor library, and we had to, in order to find the actual Genepy, we actually had to work with a French company to get it sent over here. So it's funny that we live in such a world that seems so immediately connected. It seems like we're so global right now, and yet a lot of these products in your portfolio and a lot of the flavors and traditions wrapped up in that are very local, right? And so I guess my next question about your portfolio and the geography that connects a lot of these regions together is, I imagine you've spent a bit of time traveling to some of these places, and B, assuming that that's the case, what have you learned about like the little idiosyncrasies, or kind of like that? I think of a map of Germany pre-unification, right? There are all these little regions. They're all abutting one another, but they were all so different. Do you experience that, or do you experience more of like a kind of gradual fading of cultures and flavors into one another?
I think things are different. I think one of the really obvious ones is just look at the difference between aromatized wines from France and aromatized wines from Italy, where Italian ones tend to be quite a bit sweeter. Now that's a very macro division of things, but it's just the nature of how most producers perceive their local markets. Mm-hmm. I think the strongest regional identities historically in stuff that we work with, going beyond Vermouth de Chambéry and Vermouth de Torino, which are the two protected geographic indications for vermouth that we work in with Dolin and Koki, respectively, is to look at the world of quinquina, or aromatized wine bittered with quinine. The world of quinquina didn't really rise until the 1850s, 60s, 70s, during a time when wealth had concentrated in French cities, railroads had been built, popular media was burgeoning, and photographs for popular media back then, and so advertising and marketing and branding were these beautiful poster art, and that goes into all the way through World War I. So producers in France made quinquinas to advertise their region. Bonal tastes like the Alps, all those extra mountain flowers and roots and stuff. Beer is rich and round and very friendly, something that can be quite a crowd pleasing thing, and maybe by the beach side. The quinquinas from Mate in Corsica, using Corsican grapes to get all that extra acidity and volcanic character. Corsican citrus, which was probably the thing Corsica was best known for in France, other than Napoleon, and really a fervent way of announcing Corsica's presence in the modern France. And a lot of that kind of stuff still comes today. Same thing with Koki's aromatized wines. Koki was a winery, and so their aromatized wines would show off their wines in a way, whereas the wine base for Dolin is meant to be more delicate and more about letting the herbs show through. So those things are things that we can all relate to. Certainly anyone who is into European wines can relate to the differences in wines, but don't get me wrong, it's wonderful to travel to all these places, but you can relate to them based on things you can learn even here during Corona time.
Right. And I think obviously we have, a lot of our listeners are leaning heavily into their hobby as home bartenders. So I love being able to show off some of these maybe lesser known bottles or less familiar bottles. It's really exciting to me. So as an importer, I do not often get to speak with people, kind of at you in your position in the 3-tier system. So what I'd like to do is maybe just for the education of our listeners, to be able to put you in context for like the value of what you bring to the table. Can you explain like the process that a bottle takes going from Italy or France, getting to the United States, then getting behind a bar or getting on a liquor store shelf, and like the kind of the steps that need to be negotiated in there, especially if there's a denomination of origin involved, like you were mentioning with the two, protected classifications of vermouths, for example?
Yeah, the protected classifications themselves are both managed kind of internal to the industries. So because they aren't PDOs or the highest level, they don't require a bunch of independent management. So, certainly in our work in the wine world, particularly with Madeira, it's very important to get we have to get regulatory approval from what's called the IVBAM, IVBAM, to take any wine off the island. But the producer is in charge of that, and that's usually not too big a deal. I think what's the larger thing is for anything that has botanical content or anything that has a recipe, the U.S. government will want to see the formula as well as a sample of the product to run it through a pretty strict series of lab tests. There's a variety of things of chemical compounds that are simply not permitted in the U.S. in alcoholic beverages or in most anything else. Coumarin is a famous one that's why we can't have real Zubrovka here. There is still a restriction on sujone levels for which is a wormwood extractive, though those often aren't that hard to deal with. I know there's been some issues with not prominent mezcal producers, but if you go to Oaxaca, you will often hear of batches rejected for methanol because it can happen with fruit brandies too. Those fermentations are very tricky. As a matter of fact, it's well known. There's some well-known fruit brandy producers that occasionally have to deal with methanol issues, and it happens, and often you can blend it away. So both there's both a paper process and a lab process to get a product approved. A label has to be approved, and so to give an example using Pasubio, we can't put on the label that it's Marsala because it is an infused product and it's not specifically regulated like something like Barolo Cinato. We can't put on the label that it's an infused, that it's a Marsala base. We say rich wine, I think, on the back label on a base of rich aged wine or something.
Yep.
So every bit of label text pretty much has to be approved. The government warning has to be a particular size. The words government warning have to be in bold type, etc. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff. And then it becomes, can you get a box onto a pallet and get it from point A to point B in a way that doesn't inflate the cost? So that's a lot of what Eric does now is manage the flow of orders to make sure that you, the customer, are getting the best bang for the buck out of our arranging the shipping. So we're lucky in that we don't have to consolidate between different producers very often. We get enough products from a given producer that we can fill a whole container at that producer, which helps a lot. Especially it helps with handling errors and things like that. Then you got there, but during this time, it's a little bit harder to get containers. It's a little bit harder to get ships and then get it over. We use a common warehouse in New Jersey that a lot of importers use, and then our distributors pick up from there or contract with a shipping company to pick it up from there. And then it's on us through both direct work, at least pre-corona direct work, and work through our website and other marketing avenues to raise awareness of a product, try to give folks a reason to want to taste it or try it, and several different ways to use it. It's really important in our portfolio that we bring in products that are versatile and be able to show that versatility in a substantive way.
Yeah. I mean, the difference between someone using your bottle once a week versus once a month is it adds up pretty quickly in terms of turnover and just how often someone's going to come back and pick up a fresh bottle. So that's obviously very important. So what I wanted to ask, kind of related to the process of getting a bottle from Europe to the U.S., is I had a recent interview with Chris Swanger, the president of Discus, the Distilled Spirits Council, and we were talking about some of the most recent tariffs, and obviously those are kind of going both ways right now. It's kind of ugly. It's not a good time for cheese. It's not a good time for Scotch. It's not a good time for a lot of things flowing both in this direction and toward Europe from here. So were your portfolio companies affected in this way? And I guess if so, is there a plan or a hope that things will get better or get normalized?
We were very fortunate in that we didn't have a ton of products affected because things like Pasubio are considered wine in the eyes of the law. They weren't in the Italian spirits tariff. But the impact of those tariffs is much more on the consumer, both in terms of raised prices, but also in terms of the distributors that make sure that really cool products get to your state, run into big cash flow problems associated with these. Not only the products that they buy from importers like us, but a lot of those distributors are also importers themselves, and so they're having to pay upfront tariffs to get stuff out of hock and get it to you. And so that the consolidation that you see in the spirits production world, or the wine and spirits production world, is also happening at the distribution world. And so in order for you to keep getting a good supply of cool products, you want these smaller distributors to stay alive. And that's a really important thing.
Yeah, I don't think that people necessarily associate cash flow issues with distributors. I think people very often associate them with bars because the margins are so thin, right? So, as we've been hearing news and, following the pulse of what's happening in the bar and restaurant industry, you hear this cry again and again for well, we can't open at 50% capacity because then our cash flow, we'll be operating at a loss even at 50% capacity. So that makes complete sense. I think we're all familiar with that. But, I think that for Americans who are in the know, it is easy to kind of despise the role that distributors play in the three-tier system, in that it seems like an unnecessary step between you and that bottle getting another markup. The question might be, well, why don't these distilleries or these makers just kind of get it here themselves? But as you mentioned, there's a lot of work being done on the regulatory side to make sure that all of this is navigated correctly. And so, I go back and forth. I can sympathize with people not wanting to pay for another middle person in between them and their booze. On the other hand, I think you got to step back and appreciate how much work actually goes into getting this bottle over here.
Well, let's take a look at it through the guise of order fulfillment. Most folks who are importers are going to store their products pretty close to the port, and most of that stuff is coming into New Jersey, to New York, New Jersey. So there's a few big warehouses in New Jersey where a lot of us sell. Now, let's say you're a small bar, and we love small bars. We love small retailers. And let's say that for this week, you need 4 bottles of Dolin Dry, 4 bottles of Dolin Rouge, 2 bottles of Pasubio, 2 bottles of Hayman's London Dry Gin, right? Now, you can either call, in the current system, you can call someone who can get that to you tomorrow, or you'd have to call someone representing a pile of stuff in New Jersey, and you'd have to get a carrier to want to take your one little case to, let's just say, Rapid City, South Dakota, instead of taking this 87 pallet order for Costco.
Mm-hmm.
Which one do you think they're getting paid more for?
Right.
And oh, by the way, that friend you can call to get your one mixed case of product, you can also call them at 5:00 on a Thursday, say, hey, I'm out of this one cocktail ingredient. What do you think would be a good substitute? You can get them to come and teach your staff background of stuff while you're doing something else pre-shift. If you're a shop, you can get that person to come in and pour on a Saturday afternoon, non-Corona time, and help energize your customers about drinking interesting things. So it's a lot more than just an invoice.
Right. And I think it's just so easy to overlook, right? When we walk into a liquor store, we walk into a bar, we're focused on the bottle or the glass in front of us, and the direct, immediate, proximal financial impact that has on your wallet, as opposed to everything else. So that's why I love having these conversations. I think they're really eye-opening for people, and I really want people to have a sense of how the entire industry works together, not just some segment. So that's been really helpful. Before we move on to any lightning roundy sort of stuff here, I want to talk rancio. I want to talk weird, funky, heat and oxygen affected or matured wine products, because it is something that we're going to have to do individual episodes on all these sub-regions because there's no way we can cover this all now. But can you talk about that specific kind of sub-portfolio in Haus Alpenz's, what is the name of that portfolio to begin with?
Sure. We call it Sotalone Selections, and it's a subset of our website. If you go up to wines on our website, there'll be a subsection for Sotalone. Sotalone is one of the flavonoids that you find in a lot of oxidized wines. It's sort of a maple syrup flavor. It's sometimes associated with the spice fenugreek. And this came about as kind of a collection of things we were always enthusiastic about, or that we had learned to become enthusiastic about through our travels. We working with Beer Quinquina, we spent more time in the French part of Catalonia and learned about dry rancio and the various fortified wines of that region, Banyuls, Mori, and Rivasalt. We were always Madeira fans, and we learned about Henriquez and Enriquez and really learned about how they do things very differently from what everyone else does on the island, and that you can taste it, and it makes the wines more fun to pair with food throughout a meal, as was the case in a long time ago in America. And so we decided, let's go for it. Let's do what we do on the Alpenz side and be evangelists, be teachers, and recognize that there is a practicality to some of these wines in that you can use a sample for longer. If you take out a bottle of Sauvignon Blanc as a distributor rep, you better show that to 8 or 9 people on one day, or else you haven't really operated in the service of that wine or in the service of that producer. With most of the wines in the Sotolone portfolio, it's a lot more practical from a showing and sales perspective in that way. It's also more practical for the consumer. They can buy a bottle and follow it over a few days or weeks or months, or in the case of Madeira, even a few years.
Right, for sure. So for those of you listening who want to learn more about Madeira, check out our interview with Michael Scafidi, who talks all about the story of Madeira, the various sub-varieties thereof. But I guess it's important to identify for our listeners who might not be as well versed in these things that in the Sotolone selections, they're all oxidized, meaning that a lot of aromatized or fortified wines are aged without extensive aeration or exposure to air, to oxygen. It creates that kind of tawny brownish color, and then obviously Sotolone, the flavonoid that you were referencing, that maple syrupy fenugreeky type of flavor. It's really beautiful to pair with anything from charcuterie to desserty stuff.
Yeah, and I think we've tried to be relatively precise about how we talk about pairing these things with food. We start with dry rancio, the unfortified, fully oxidized wines of Catalunya, mainly from the little sliver of Catalunya that's in France, what we call the Roussillon. Those are wines that have an intense level of umami, high but very developed and complex acidity, and then of course the nuttiness and characteristics that you would find in an oxidized wine. And so the most traditional thing to pair with those wines in the region is anchovies. The anchovies are very hard to pair with wine because they're salty, they're fishy, they're full of umami. They trot on a lot of what we call normal wines or reductive wines. But rancio wines work with pretty much anything salty. The salt will kind of cause the wine to express more richly on the palate, but the acid of the wine will cleanse the palate of the intense fat and protein that you sometimes find in those kind of foods. In the world of Madeira, remember that Madeira can go from very dry to very sweet. But I think one of the things where H&H's wines are so different is because they make and blend their wines to be about the full expression of the acidity. They don't put in a young wine in a blend labeled 10 years old. Every drop of it is at least 10 years old. They don't put any red grape Madeira into wines that are labeled as coming from a white grape. The allowance is 15%, but by not doing so, you don't get any of that extra rich red grape texture in those wines. And so a Cercial from H&H actually goes really well with oysters, which is the traditional American pairing for oysters, a Cercial Madeira. The Verdalho Madeiras work so well with richer fish dishes or chicken, or I find they go with very profound, hard cow's milk cheeses. And so a lot of this information is on our website, but it's also when you talk to us, we've been through it, and we often will show, don't tell those kind of conversations. I'd much rather show you that Coqui Vermouth de Torino goes with salami, or even that a rancio wine goes with anchovies. They make Tupperware that screws closed, so you don't get the fishy smell in your bag so badly. I'd rather show you that than tell you that.
Yeah, and in researching for these interviews, sometimes you come across interesting articles, and there happens to be an article that features your tool of choice when going out and plying your trade. So can you talk a little bit about your tool of choice? And I loved reading that article. I was cracking up.
So as I imagine most of you out there who have ever made drinks for yourself or other people offsite, I have a sheathed bar knife. Mine is by Kunrikon, which I can buy at my local Wegmans. And it allows me to travel with a knife in my check luggage without being too worried about stick in myself when I'm unpacking. And it allows me, when I'm setting up for a tasting, to prepare either citrus peels, if I'm talking about spritzes or those sorts of garnishes, or snacks. Again, a lot of this is pre-Corona. I don't know how well communal snacks are going to go over for a while post-Corona, but I can cut up a nice mild Alpine cheese to go with a Blanc Vermouth, or slice a salami, and I often use American producers such as Oli or Olympia Provisions, I guess they're called now, to go with a big intense vermouth, red vermouth, and it's a variety. Do it for a variety of reasons. One, it's a way of talking about versatility, that these things aren't just for cocktails or aren't just for one specific purpose. Two, in a lot of states that I work in, the shops that sell wine don't sell booze, particularly in Virginia and North Carolina, and New Hampshire, and Maine. The shops that sell wine, by and large, don't sell booze. So it's great to talk about Manhattans, but if someone can't walk out with a bottle of whiskey with their vermouth, then I'm not serving the retailer the best way I can. And last is it's fun. It's fun. It's different. It's context, and it's you're not making someone daydream. You're giving someone something to eat.
Yeah, and I think it's nice also to be able to have something to do, to actually have a little manual task to do, because people, I think, feel less freaked out about kind of checking out what you're doing if you're not just sitting there with your arms folded looking at them. But hey, who knows? I mean, maybe you can still do what you do, but you'll just need to partner with a commercial kitchen to make you a little Lunchables style thing, and just you roll out your little red wagon like a soccer mom and start throwing out Lunchables, and pair it with your Haus Alpenz portfolio.
I just hope that we can get to a point that this conversation is even something we can countenance, because it means that I'll be back on the road, and we'll be wanting to teach in the old way, and won't be still hemmed in by a really terrible virus.
Yeah. I hesitate to get into rancio, so we won't do that. It's just too big of a subject. So I guess I'll just wrap up this main portion of the interview by asking, is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners about Haus Alpenz, about kind of the state of the union of things now, or about things to get excited about in terms of spirits or aromatized wines?
I think from our portfolio, I think it's fun to get excited about simple mixtures, simple drinks, a glug of this, a glug of that. And there's a lot on our website that goes into these very, very simple mixtures, things that you can put in a glass with some ice and go sit by the grill, or hang out with your kids, or do something other than worrying about making a perfectly presented cocktail. And so that in our recipe section, there's a lot of 50-50 drinks. There's a lot of stuff in the text on our website. I think we're gonna be here for a while. I see so many of my friends in the bar world who are real talisman, but it's going to be very, very hard to justify, both for them the cash flow and the risk to opening broadly while we're still in the midst of this. And so a lot of them have done a great job of creating extra value for themselves out of to-go things and doing educations, and I love all of that, and it's always happy to support all of that, and some really savvy ones have turned into some really good bottle shops, which is a lot of fun to watch.
Yeah, it's still very much up in the air, but one of the things that I do really love about your site, we've referenced it sort of in passing as we've been talking, but you do have, with the descriptions of the selections that you offer, you do have really good pairing notes there. And
Yeah.
I think especially for these slightly more esoteric or less common, at least here in the States, bottles, I think that's really important because, I think I have a decent palate and I still find myself, pulling out the flavor Bible on a weekly basis, or, when I'm trying to, build a cocktail, I always go to the manufacturer's site and see at least see where they're starting to recommend things. So, for people who are now, let's assume that you've drunk down your liquor cabinet a little since this has all gotten started and you're looking to replenish. My recommendation would be to do that intelligently, to try and plan it out and, look for things that are going to pair with what you're going to be eating over the next couple of months. We do have lots of fresh produce coming available here in the U.S., and a lot of people have been, myself included, have been doing, their little gardening projects since we've all been stuck at home. So if your tomatoes are getting close, well, maybe, think about what you're going to pair with those. And I think most of us just aren't aware of some of the resources online, specifically from the makers and the importers like yourselves, that are just sitting there largely unused by consumers who just walk into the liquor store and read labels,
Yeah, and if you haven't had a red snapper with Heyman's Royal Dock Gin, then this is your chance to get it with your own tomatoes.
Yeah, the red snapper being sort of a ginny Bloody Mary take for those who aren't familiar. So, Jake, are you ready to jump into some lightning round questions here?
Sure.
All right. What is your favorite cocktail? And if you don't have a favorite of all time, what's something you've more recently fallen in love with?
So I think a lot of folks who have met me out there know my love of low alcohol stirred cocktails, and so I'm not gonna take it down to one, but I will occasionally refer to 4 drinks as the impregnable quadrilateral of low alcohol stirred drinks. It's the Adonis, which is a sherry and red vermouth stirred drink. The Bamboo, which I firmly believe is Vino or Manzanilla and dry vermouth. The Chrysanthemum, which is dry vermouth Benedictine absinthe. And the Rose, which is dry vermouth Kirschwasser raspberry syrup. And those are 4 drinks that are really, really fun to talk about, to drink, and they get you ready for dinner in a wonderful way.
Yeah, I think especially the two, the first two you mentioned, the Bamboo and the Adonis, are pretty easy and accessible. You can create them exclusively using Haus Alpenz's offerings. Do you offer a Kirschwasser?
No, and I mean the Adonis and Bamboo, as stated, are sherry drinks, and we don't import any sherry or Manzanilla or Montilla or Cordoba or. But I mean, certainly people do variations using dry rancio as the base for those 2 drinks. We don't import a Kirschwasser. There are quite a few good ones in the market, including some made here in America. Don't get too worried about using too much of it. You don't need much more than 3/4 of an ounce in that drink of a good Kirschwasser. And remember that raspberry syrup. Certainly it's nice to make your own raspberry syrup, but the raspberry syrup in cocktails of the time would have been similar to the raspberry syrup used to flavor medications. So if you make a batch with frozen raspberries and you keep it in the freezer and use it several months later, it's still going to be fine.
Yeah, sure. Cool. All right, next question. If you were a cocktail ingredient, what would you be and why?
Oh, geez. I guess Quinquina. Quinquina is a bit maligned or misunderstood. People think it's vermouth. Quinquina has a particular history of and expressiveness. Quinquina works in some ways like vermouth, but in many ways not like vermouth. It's a little. You have to kind of get into it to really explore it. And so that's something, I don't know if I would personify that, but it's certainly something that intrigues me in a particular way.
Yeah, it's fascinating hearing you speak earlier about how the rise of the Quinquina kind of was aided and abetted by some of the new media at the time. So I'll definitely have to do a little bit more research on that. And obviously, it is not a category that is super prevalent here in the US. So again, that might be something where people need to go a little bit farther afield to actually do the research. All right. Well, moving on then. If you could have a cocktail with anyone in the world, past or present, who would that be? Where would you go? What would you drink? Just kind of paint us a little picture.
Gosh, I mean, there's a technical answer to that question. I'd like to I'd like to meet the first person who got famous in ancient Rome for making vermouth. The Greeks were doing it. We're adding wormwood to wine, but the Romans made it kind of a societal thing, and of course we would drink their vermouth. In terms of a historic answer, I've always been fascinated by the history of gastronomy in the city of Lyon in France, and so much of it is driven by the very famous chef La Mère Brasier, who was sort of the woman who held an iron fist over the restaurants of Lyon back at the beginning of the 20th century. And I would like to know what she has for breakfast on an off day and what she's drinking with it.
Nice. Yeah, Lyon's a very, very important city in that regard, and it's a shame that most people, when they visit, end up going to Paris and Normandy and sort of like the western regions of France, but don't always make it to those internal non-coastal cities where there's just so much beautiful culture around the things to eat and drink. So what's a common or well, this might be tricky. Dang, I just happened to ask this question to all the people who have incredibly wide experience tasting. But is there a common or traditional cocktail ingredient that comes to mind that you've never tasted, and if so, why?
I've never tasted Arak from Sri Lanka.
Okay,
coconut spirit. There is one that's commercialized in the UK just under the name Ceylon Arak. The word Arak just means booze in pretty much every language in the world in some way, shape, or form. And so we work with a cane spirit from what we now call Indonesia called Batavia Arak. Batavia Arak is a molasses spirit that's fermented with a little bit of koji. Batavia Arak certainly had a huge following in punch houses in London, where it was sort of the poshest thing you could get a punch with. But Sri Lankan Arak was certainly drunk and mixed in a variety of ways, in a variety of cultural contexts, and I've never had one.
Yeah, interesting. There's a lot of cool stuff coming out of India, obviously being kind of spearheaded by Paul John and the work that they're doing in the whiskey space. But there's also lots of sort of what we might consider in the West alternative bases being used. And so yeah, I think a lot of those spirits are going to be some of the more exciting things that if they do manage to make it here are going to be pretty sought after, I think, when bars start to reopen and normalize their programs again.
Well, if the quality is there and the price is there, I mean, there is a practicality to this business, which is unavoidable.
Right. All right, last big question. What's an unusual or controversial view or belief that you hold in the spirits and cocktail world?
I like a lot of dilution in brown spirit cocktails. I think that, if you go back in the history of brown spirits, and particularly whiskey for cocktails, back in the day when all the classic whiskey cocktails were written, those whiskeys were older whiskeys that had, in almost every case, a lower barrel entry proof and raised in barrels of much older wood that had been weathered a lot more before it was made into a barrel. And so the wood expression in those whiskeys was much rounder, more complex, less tannic, less lignant, almost getting with extra age a little bit even bit of an umami effect. And so those whiskeys just tasted different cold and much more supple cold than most of the whiskeys today that we can afford to mix with. And so if you take the same proportions and the same mixing technique, you're going to get a drink that's a lot more tannic today, or lignic. Lignan's the word for wood tannins. You're going to get a drink that's much harsher on the palate than you would have gotten 120, 140 years ago.
Yep, and that's,
at the same time, though, the only other really tannic thing that we drink is red wine, and you don't serve red wine ice cold. And so I always sort of think for brown spirit drinks, more dilution, which you can't do with ice. At some point, you just have to add water. and a warmer drinking temperature, not ice cold, not worrying about getting those drinks ice cold. Get the dilution right and get the dilution enough. And the cocktail will dance across your palate. It might become more liquid. You actually drink it faster and you'll be more refreshed by it and you'll be ready to move on to dinner or a next drink or whatnot. You'll taste the whiskey more. You'll taste the other ingredients more. But that's a hard thing, especially in the on-premise world where people expect a bar person to put everything in a mixing glass with ice, stir it, strain it, and set it forth, and it's supposed to be exactly perfect right then.
Mm-hmm, exactly. It's interesting to think about the idea of a refreshing old-fashioned or the idea of the old-fashioned as being something that you might drink before dinner versus after dinner. And I love the impulse to consider what might have been different about the spirits and cocktails being drunk in the mid 19th century compared to what we've got today. Because I think if you skip that step, it turns into a bit of a navel gazing practice in that you're like, well, of course you're going to agree with yourself, right? So I love that gesture toward context, and I think that's one of the things that makes you a particularly effective and compelling educator.
Well, that's very kind of you to say. I mean, I would say you can very easily go overboard in this conversation. I think that today, even though there's a lot of gins today that don't really work in traditional cocktails, and that there's a whole business associated with those kind of gins, I think the best of traditional gins today are as good as they've ever been. We're very fortunate to represent some of those in Hayman's and work incredibly well in traditional cocktails across the canon of traditional cocktails. But I think that the brown spirit world, I think we're so used to seeing a Manhattan or a drink like that as having to be this punchy thing that we sort of lose sight of. Well, okay, you've been served a Manhattan. Now, are you going to drink it, or are you going to sit there and wait for it to warm up?
Yeah, exactly. Well, Jake, this has been an absolute pleasure. Can you just wrap us up and take us home here by letting folks know where they can connect with you and with Haus Alpenz, both on social media and on the interwebs?
Sure. Our website is alpenz.com, although hausalpenz.com does redirect. We are at Haus Alpenz on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. On Instagram and Facebook, we are at Sodalone Selections for more info on the oxidative side of our book. And my Instagram is Jake H. Parrott, 2 R's, 2 T's. I still have a Twitter, but I don't really use it very much.
Samesies. Well, Jake, this has been a lot of fun. Of course, I would, as long as it's legal to do so, in a world where it would be legal to do so, I would encourage people to go out and check out the Haus Alpenz portfolio at your favorite establishments, whether on premise or off premise. And those are our words in the industry for bars and restaurants versus liquor stores. And otherwise, just thank you so much for your time and your expertise.
Thanks for having me.
Hey everybody, thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, there's 2 big things you can do for us here at Modern Bar Cart. One would be to tell your friends and family if you think they'd enjoy listening to us talk about cocktails. And if they don't download podcasts, they can always stream our episodes on their desktop directly from the show notes page at modernbarcart.com. The other thing you can do to help would be to head on over to iTunes or wherever you download your podcasts and leave us a review. 5 stars are great, but we're more interested in your feedback. And the beauty is, the more reviews we have, the easier it will be for other folks out there to learn about our show. We're trying to start a cocktail revolution here, and by spreading the word, you're helping us fight the good fight. You can always reach us by emailing podcast@modernbarcart.com if you're looking for cocktail or bartending advice, or if you're a pro who would like to pull up a mic and be interviewed for all to hear. Also, definitely follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Modern Bar Cart for cocktail porn, recipes, and entertaining tips. And keep an eye out for new product releases and special offers, which are happening all the time. We love our listeners, and we really enjoy giving you exclusive discounts and sneak peeks at our latest and greatest cocktail projects. This episode may be over, but for you, the mixological fun and adventures are just beginning, so remember, folks, drink responsibly and experiment boldly. This episode was made possible with editing and production assistance by Samantha Reed, oxidized and low-proof spirits and high-octane flavor courtesy of Jake Parrott and Haus Alpenz, and a little bit of interview magic by yours truly. This has been a Modern Bar Cart production, copyright 2020.